Australian Institute of Energy event on the consumer data right. I would like firstly to show my respect and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land of elders and past and present on which this virtual meeting takes place. And today we are delighted to be joined for a panel discussion by leading executives and thought leaders from 3 key organizations responsible for the consumer data right and its extension into the energy sector here in Australia. And I will go through and introduce very briefly our panelists. Our first panelist this morning is Violette Mouchaileh, Executive General Manager, Emerging Markets and Services at AIE. Violette leads emerging markets and services, and that includes the responsibility for distributed energy, resources, data initiatives, including the consumer data right and energy. We're also joined today by Paul Franklin, Executive General Manager, Consumer Data Right at the ACCC. Paul joined the ACCC in January this year to head up its new standalone CDR division, and he has over 20 years experience in the banking industry. Also, we've got on the panel James Bligh, the lead architect, consumer data right at the data standards body. James is currently the lead architect for CDR and has been responsible for the creation of the first API standard to be mandated by the federal government on CDR. And lastly, I will introduce the facilitator for today, Joe Delaney from the AIE Melbourne Committee and also Director Strategy at Nexa Advisory. Joe has over 20 years experience in the global technology sector and has expertise in the digitization and open data on customer-focused energy transition. So before I hand over to Joe to facilitate our session today, I'd like to invite everybody to make sure that you participate. We want to have an open discussion with our panelists while we have them. So we are encouraging everyone to ask lots of questions, and we're hoping to have a discussion with everyone. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Joe.
Thanks very much, Stephanie. Appreciate the introduction. So what we're going to do today, everyone, is start with an opportunity for the 3 panelists to give an opening perspective, which will just be a few minutes each, just to set the scene for what they see as the key opportunities and challenges around implementing CDR and the relationship with the energy sector. Obviously, Paul and James come from a banking background and have got a lot of extensive experience already with the implementation of CDR into banking, and we're going to see and hear some of the learnings from that. And Violette, obviously, as you all know, very close to all things energy with the perspective that comes from leading CDR for AEMO. So with that, I might just invite the panelists to say a few opening words and a few opening thoughts, and then we'll jump into more of a round table, a series of questions. I'll start with a couple, and then, as Stephanie said, if from an audience perspective, you can start your thoughts flowing and really share any key questions that you'd like asked using the Q&A function. So what I might do is just hand over. Maybe we'll start with Violette, if you'd like to say a few words, Violette, and then we'll pass to the other panelists and then back to the discussion.
Oh, happy to. Good morning, everyone. Hope everyone's keeping well and safe in these interesting times. Just a little bit about AEMO, for those who don't know who we are. We're the Australian energy market operator across the east coast of Australia and Western Australia as well. So we operate the power system, the energy power system, and we also facilitate a lot of the markets to deliver reliable, secure and affordable energy for consumers. We also do facilitate retail market processes, which are a lot of the business to business type processes to enable a lot of the players in the sector to be able to offer services to consumers. And we also have responsibilities in the gas space as well. So I'm delighted to be here along with the panelists to talk through consumer data right. I might just make a couple of observations around what's happening in the sector itself, and I'm sure James and Paul will talk about consumer data right more generally. I think, as many of you are very well aware, there's a lot of changes going on in the energy sector, and a lot of that change in the energy sector landscape is driven by consumers. I think consumers are really at the heart of some of the changes that are occurring. You know, with access to different types of technologies, innovative type of products, seeing more multi-sector convergence occurring, and consumer expectations very loud and clear around secure, reliable and affordable and sustainable energy going forward. So with those changes, what we're seeing is quite a significant change in the sector itself, with consumers having more access to, you know, supply at their premises, and not just being a taker of energy, but a supplier of that at its premises. We're seeing quite a significant change occurring in the way the system works, in the way the markets work, the actors work in that sector as well. And not only at the consumer end, but we're also seeing some of those significant changes at the large scale generation side as well. So with all these changes occurring, I think what we are very mindful of is that data becomes such a critical asset for a lot of us, in terms of it plays a key role in enabling the various sectors to function, and for the consumers to be able to better make choices and decisions around, you know, its supplier, its investment decisions around self-consumption, and a range of other things, and how it may compare services and energy with other services in other sectors. So consumer data right really does have a very important role, and potentially a very important role to play in actually facilitating that innovation and that consumer choice more so. So at the heart of it, we're sort of seeing that consumers will then understand their rights to access and use the data that's stored, be more empowered by having control over the data and the choice to share that data, and gaining access to new and innovative sort of services, not just currently available in the sector itself, but across multi-sectors. So as part of designing the economy model, very conscious of wanting to make sure that there is a economy-wide model for consumer data right. There's this kind of balance between how do you do that and how do you make sure that consumers get value out of CDR and energy as well. And so as part of this sort of process, we've had the introduction of a gateway model, which is, you know, why I'm here sort of talking as part of this process. The gateway model wasn't about trying to be different. It was actually trying to design something that sits within the broader consumer data right platform, as a way to sort of facilitate sort of data exchange between various parties. And at the heart of it, really, it was about how do you take cost, complexity and duplication out of the system, so that overall consumer gets value, and that we're not sort of implementing something that's very costly at the end of this. So look, I'm happy to talk a little bit more if there's questions about CDR and energy, and some of the experiences we're sort of having with some of the work that we've been doing on the consumer data platform as well. But you know, we're very keen to work in partnership with, you know, James and his team and Paul and his team and the industry itself to define the role of the gateway, so that it can deliver value for consumers, it can deliver value for the industry, and we get the right outcomes at the end of the day. So with that, I might just stop there, and happy to take questions.
Thanks, Violette. Appreciate that. So what we'll do, we'll go around the rest of the panelists, and then we'll sort of bring those perspectives together, and we'll open up more of a sort of roundtable discussion. But with that, I might bring in Paul just to say a few words from the perspective at the ACCC, and what he's seen sort of holistically across the CDR process, and lessons as well potentially from the banking experience.
Thank you. So the ACCC has the role of implementing the consumer data right. We write the rules, we developed the register and accreditation platform that data recipients and data holder use to connect to each other and verify each other's identity. As Violette said, it's very much our intention to have one consumer data right across the whole economy, not one for banking and one for energy and one for other sectors as standalone organisations, but to have one sort of consistent set of processes. I think the benefits of having that single consumer data right start with competition, in that it should be easier to compare or switch energy providers. But having access to multiple data sets across different industries might eventually lead to innovation in the way services are delivered. And a great way to think about that is that Google once took map data, search capability, information about local businesses, and they created the ability to find local food vendors who could, you know, if you were looking for a hamburger near where you are, they can tell you where that is. So while we very much want to deliver the early benefits of increased competition, there's also a very important role for innovation as well in what are the new products and services that would be possible to offer if there were large numbers of data sets available. So initially, CDR and energy will apply in the states that are in the national electricity market. That excludes Western Australia and Northern Territory. There are two features that distinguish the implementation model from energy from banking. That is the potential involvement of more than one data holder in providing a single data request, and the adoption of the gateway model that Violette mentioned to facilitate accredited third-party access to consumer data. The current consumer data right rules will apply to the energy sector in conjunction with some additional sector-specific rules for energy. There's a consultation we have open on the rules framework for energy that closes tomorrow. We're very grateful for those who've taken the time to provide submissions and for people who participated in our recent workshop. Following the consultation, that will inform the drafting of specific rules for the energy sector and possibly amendments for the general rules. And those rules are expected to be made in the first half of next year, with technical build for the ecosystem taking place during the following financial year. So there's quite a long time frame, and we certainly found with banking that a long implementation time frame is necessary. We also anticipate that growth in the consumer data right, starts small, but we intend to offer sort of regular increases of functionality so that there's scope to sort of keep feeding exponential growth in the take-up. And that's consistent with what we've seen in other regimes in the UK, for example. There's a lot of interest in Australia's consumer data right model because it's whole of economy rather than just banking. And a lot of countries are now looking to the Australian model to see if they can replicate that, including that New Zealand recently put out a consultation paper for the possible adoption of a similar regime.
Thanks, Paul. And thirdly, but by no means lastly, we'll pass over to James from the Data Standards Body.
Thanks, Joe. The Data Standards Body is accountable for advising the Data Standards Chair for the Consumer Data Right to create standards for data sharing. That's essentially what I do, and that's essentially what the Data Standards Body do. We work with the stakeholders in the sector. We work with the ACCC and Paul's team. We work with Treasury, who do the designation. And within the constraints of the designation and the rules, we create the actual technical standards that actually get implemented. We do that through open and transparent consultation. So that's where I fit into this process and where the Data Standards Body fits into the process. Getting back to the original framing of the question, what are we passionate about? I've worked in banking, but I've also worked in health insurance. I've worked in other insurance companies. I've worked in a whole range of sectors, telecommunications, blah, blah, blah. Spent a lot of time in IT. one commonality in my personal history is working in digital technology, digital enablement, creating experiences for people, simplifying processes. And if you look at the way the world is, the way digital technology has transformed so many industries, it's quite an exciting area, and it's always been an area that I've been passionate about. Within that context, APIs and API development is a fundamental aspect of that. But it can be done very badly. So getting to why, how I feel about the CDR and CDR applied to electricity and that kind of thing. There's two things about the CDR regime that get me up in the morning and that I'm really passionate about. One is, as both Violette and Paul mentioned, is that it is cross-sector, and that's a globally unique thing, and other jurisdictions are now looking at that. But the fact that it's cross-sector means that it has the ability to create innovation and business models that just have never existed before. Innovation in verticals, fintechs. Even the term fintech means that it's a vertical in finance. Energy tech is a vertical in energy. What the CDR really can transform innovation in Australia into is economy-wide innovation, which I find exciting because I don't know what that means. In a lot of the things we do, we can say, oh, this is for comparison, or this is for a loan application, or this is for a switching of a plan. There's a very clear use case in mind. For the CDR, one of the things that is excellent, but also a real challenge, is we're building for the unknown use case. We're building for the thing that could be awesome, but we don't know what that's going to be, and it'll be other people that do that. So really a lot of what I do is try and ensure that we're not constraining the standards to a specific scenario or use case. So we're leaving the maximal opportunity for innovation to occur using the things. Everybody's investing a lot to make this thing happen. If we can maximize the innovation that comes out of it, that is awesome. And I find that, a real challenge. And it's something that I'm really interested in. The second thing is the C in consumer data right. A lot of the regimes around the world that have been tackling things like this are very industry focused, and they start with the industry incumbents and the data and the industry itself. But the consumer data right starts with the consumer and giving control to the consumer. And I think that is a very powerful aspect of the regime, and one that is really important. If you look at the two sectors we've been looking at, banking and electricity, they're both ubiquitous. Most Australians have a bank account. Most Australians have electricity in their house. They're the same customers. But if you actually look at how enabled the consumers are in those two sectors, and then you apply that to telecommunications, the enablement is very different. The level of control they have is very different, but these are the same people. If we could give, at the same time, you've got Facebook and, other big tech companies coming in. I don't want to call out in specifically, but that sector is coming in and they're not putting the consumer first. They're not giving control. They're not biased towards putting control in the hands of the user. They're biased towards the platform. The consumer data right has a real opportunity to address some of those things and effectively do the work that sets up our economy for digital enablement for the next 50 years. If we get this right, consumers will control their data, they'll control their environment, and they'll understand how to do that consistently, and that can have amazing flow-on consequences later on. So as you can tell, I'm very interested in this topic. I'm very passionate about it, and that's what drives me in this. With regards to challenge for the electricity sector, I would suggest that the major challenge is that it's the second sector. Arguably doing the first sector is pretty easy. You're very focused, you know what you're trying to do, and you're thinking about the future, but it was very contained what we were doing. Now we're doing the second sector. We're not only having to look back to the first one and see how do we get that commonality that Paul mentioned, so that we are talking about a single CDR, but we're also thinking about how do we scale this to the third, the fourth, the fifth sector. So the added challenge for electricity, if we'd started with electricity, we would have had the same challenges in banking. The fact that we're doing it second means that we have the challenge of the gateway, the challenge of it's a new sector and all that sort of stuff that we had with banking, but we also have the challenge of it's the first cross-sector use case. So we've got to balance all of those things at the same time.
Fantastic. I can sense the passion there, James, and really appreciate the panelists' opening thoughts. And we're starting to get some questions coming through, but I might take the chair's prerogative to get us underway with a theme here, because it's coming out really loud and clear as well from what the panelists are talking about. The multi-sector nature of what we're dealing with here, actually, to me, sort of also parallels extrememe well with what's going on in the energy transition anyway. And James, you sort of finished up there with a sort of the time frame that this is going to pan out over. Well, actually, and we look at the decarbonisation of electricity, and then really opening up the cross-economy decarbonisation. So you decarbonise electricity supply, and then you electrify everything else. Now that's going to dominate, as we know, reading all of the incredible analysis that's come out, as I'm sure many of the audience has done, especially around AEMO's ISP. We're looking at this next 20-30 year time frame. The Australian states have all committed to net zero emissions by 2050. So effectively, we're dealing with a similar issue here. This is not just energy decarbonisation, this is decarbonising the economy. And CDR at its heart, as the panelists have rightly explained, is doing the same thing. It's really geared about opening up a future of multi-sector services. That, yes, and it is difficult to say exactly what they might be at the moment. But I'd like maybe to get the panelists thought. I mean, maybe start with Violette in terms of the relationship between the reforms, the energy market reforms that are going to be so critical to succeeding with the path to decarbonisation, and CDR. Maybe if you could share with us some of what you think the interdependencies are, and what particularly I've got in mind there is around the journey towards two-sided markets. If we're to succeed with engaging and implementing two-sided markets, we have to have that participation from the consumer or the emerging prosumer. So it seems to me that there's a very close alignment here with what we're trying to do with CDR. But I might invite you for your perspective on that, Violette.
Sure, thank you, Joe. I mean, I sort of touched a little bit on it in my opening remarks. Absolutely, I think as part of most people, I'm hoping, have seen the ISP work that was released recently, and I suppose today we released the electricity statement of opportunity on the East Coast as well. I think what that's clearly sort of showing is the changing energy mix that we're expecting, but not just at the large scale end. We're sort of seeing, to your point, Joe, the uptake of distributed resources, not just solar. We're talking battery systems. We're talking the electrification of the transport system, and so that transformation in itself, we're seeing, energy sort of extending and probably cementing a lot of its kind of cross-sector relationships. So with that change that's occurring, and a lot of that is driven by the access to technologies, the digitalisation, as James has sort of indicated, of what's going on with, and also I suppose, consumer expectations. They look at probably telecommunications and other sectors and going, well, I expect this of energy, those changing expectations. That means that the regulatory reform and other reforms in the energy space have to actually change to facilitate that. So we're seeing the system move to a two-sided, not in the future, it's moving now. We're seeing, what we used to design for is sort of peak kind of issues. We're sort of now seeing the variability that peak and minimum and troughs because of just consumers leveraging their own supply. And so as we design the two-sided market as part of the Energy Security Board process, that effectively is going, how do we create flexibility markets, not just a very rigid market. It's a flexibility market where you've got buyers and sellers, you know, demand and supply, effectively, you know, flexing as it needs to share sort of common sort of assets. And at the heart of a lot of the work that's been done in the two-sided market is the introduction of other actors into the energy ecosystem. You know, we've seen it through the peak shaving work that the AMC sort of landed, like introduction of third parties into the energy market. We're sort of seeing it through some of the trials that have been conducted by many parties, including ourselves, around how do you introduce these aggregators and that can aggregate services and offer, you know, services into the system and to networks and to many parties, right? So by its nature, the two-sided will create the access and avenue for other parties to enter and exchange value with energy and then exchange it into other sectors. So CDR, and there's a lot of sort of commonalities, I think, and to my point earlier, in order for that to work, data becomes really sort of a bit of the critical component for people to play their role in facilitating those consumer outcomes. So I think when you look at the sector and you look at CDR, there's a lot of commonalities in terms of what it's trying to drive towards.
Thanks, Violette. I might look to bring in James and Paul to see if they've got any perspectives to share on the challenges with alignment between the reform process.
Well, I'd say that there's certainly a question of you know, if you have multiple changes happening at the same time, understanding the combined impact of those changes, and also you often have a problem where the same group of people are having to implement each change. So I think it's important for us to find an implementation schedule that allows for orderly introduction of successive changes in a way that makes sense, and where the interim states are actually don't break anything. So there's definitely a coordination challenge in the way that's done.
You talk, Paul, about it being a process that's got to be done in a steady and implemented over a long time frame, and I think we can certainly see the reasons for that. But what came out to me as well in some of the comments you made was about, and I think James the same here, right, that sort of future innovation and making sure we're, without wanting to put words in your mouths, we're looking beyond the horizon. We're not just, you know, looking at what is obvious to us today, maybe around comparison, switching in banking and in energy, but beyond to the innovation of the future. How, you know, maybe if you could sort of share some thoughts, and James, I might bring you in on that, because I know as well your passions for this. What's your sort of perspective on what some of those challenges are going to be, given that we've got this sort of this understandable focus on the immediate? How do we design a set of rules here that are going to be flexible enough to be able to transition and grow without restricting that future innovation?
I can comment on that. I might just step back a bit, because I think it'll help put it in context, my answer for that, to what you were talking about with the decarbonisation. It is very tempting to look at all these regulatory reforms as, you know, oh, it's a compliance activity, another regulatory reform. The thing I emphasise about what the CDR is trying to do is it's about enablement. So it is a compliance reform, but in the banking sector, the banks that have been participating have only been looking at it as a regulatory reform, and I've got to do compliance and meet the minimum standard. And there's all this money on the table that they're leaving because they can actually now get access to data. And so they're not looking at it as an opportunity. And some regulatory reforms are of that nature, for good reason. But the CDR is about opportunity. It's about leverage. So when we talk about decarbonisation, for instance, if we could bring the startup community to that space to create services that help people understand how much carbon they're using, and how they could change their behaviour to reduce it, and how they could change their behaviour to manage their costs in a scenario with escalating costs as we move to decarbonisation, and came up with really effective digitally enabled ways of managing that. Would that help? Yes, it would. It would help the decarbonisation process. I see CDR as something that helps these other initiatives. In the banking sector, there's things like understanding what you're lending and what you can afford, and managing your money so that you don't default on loans. Access to data and understanding of your data in these services helps that. So I actually see the CDR as a, if you like, a multiplier. The faster we do this, the more innovation we can bring to the table, and the faster the other problems can be resolved. So that would be the first thing I'd say. With regards to rules and doing that, there's two approaches to any form of change, in my experience, in delivering solutions for the last few decades. You can do what we traditionally call the waterfall model, where you spend a lot of time designing something until it's perfect, and then you build it and deploy it. Or you can do things iteratively. Now, if you're building a building, you want to do the first model, because you can't build the 13th floor before the second floor. You know, it doesn't work. You need to design the thing and then build it. But we understand buildings. No one's ever done this before. So the practical reality of CDR is it needs to be iterative. We will need to go out with a standard that is not 100% right. We will need to go out with rules that are not 100% right. And we will then have to change them to improve them. And we may go out with rules and standards that at the time are fine, and then customer behaviour changes in response to what we've done, and now we need to adjust them again. That is also a reality. It's sort of like the Heisenberg's uncertainty principle of digital enablement. So the reality is that regimes like this are not one and done. They're iterative, and we're now finding this in the banking sector. Product reference data has gone out. People are starting to use the data, and they're now coming back and saying, oh, we'd like to change it because it's not really meeting our needs and we need to modify it. And so we're now having to go through this iterative process. We're doing exactly the same thing with the rules. So the thing I'd say to the electricity community is that this is not a one and done. This is going to be an iterative activity, and it's going to be characterised by MVP and phased rollout and improvement over time, etc.
Thanks for sharing that, James. We've actually we're starting to get some terrific questions coming in as well from the audience. So I might start bringing and introducing some of those for the panelists to consider as well. For instance, we've had a question from somebody around: will the impact of CDR? How will it impact the electricity distribution business's access to customer data where it's used for the network operation? Maybe Violette, that's a question you might have a perspective on.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's sort of the same as, so in terms of data that the network might need for its network operation, I mean, we do have a regulatory framework that, and a legal set of architecture that sort of works in the energy space, where you've got energy laws, rules, and subordinate instruments that make sure that the various actors in the energy electricity sector are able to access the things that they need to perform their functions. So that would apply to the network. So if the network has an ability to access the data that it needs in order to perform its network operational functions, that would still continue to occur, and that would be governed by the electricity framework that exists. In the same way that AEMO, for example, if it needs certain data to perform its operational function or its market function or its settlement function to keep that market whole, that would be governed by the electricity and the gas frameworks that exist to support the operation of that system and that market. So I don't see CDR necessarily impacting that. You know, CDR is all about data access for consumers and accredited sort of parties that is governed by CDR. So the two sort of exist together.
Yeah, and an interesting sort of follow-up or connected point on, and I think this came up maybe on the ACCC call in terms of the the NECF, the National Electricity Customer Framework, and the rules that are basically set around data access at the moment for customers. And I think one of the comments was that, you know, that will remain the case until such time as it's, you know, ministers decide to move it. But does that risk potentially a lack of focus or a lessening of focus on consumer access? You know, do we see that as being a potential issue if we're focusing solely on the accredited data recipient and not the consumer access? Is there any concern? I know it sort of came up before. Any Paul, maybe you want to share a perspective on that?
Well, consumer data right is primarily all about consumers, but it's very dependent on the ability of data recipients to put an offer to consumers, because it's you essentially need three things. You need the data holders to make the data available, either themselves or through a gateway. You need data recipients to have customer value propositions that they can offer that make good use of that data. And then you need the consumers to opt in to use that. So I think it's a necessary condition that you have all three of those things. The first one you can meet by a regulatory obligation, saying you must make your data available. The second one you can influence, that is accessed by data recipients. You can facilitate by making sure it's relatively straightforward and not too expensive to get access to the regime, and by making sure that it's easy for consumers to participate. And then ultimately, it's up to all of the participants in the ecosystem to convince the consumers to participate. And I think that will be largely driven by the ease for consumers and by the value of the propositions that are put to consumers. I noticed in the questions there's also a question about consumer apathy. And I'd say that the competition benefits arise in a couple of different ways. The first is just the threat of competition might lead the energy providers to be more competitive, and it might lead the banking providers to be more competitive if they're aware that the competitive environment will be getting more competitive. The second is that consumers who choose to exercise their right and switch can get a personal benefit, and secondly, and thirdly, that the products on offer might improve for everybody because of the change of consumer behaviour and the threat of ongoing further competition.
No, I think that's helpful. I think touching on one of the other questions around, maybe this segues quite nicely. The experiences that we're seeing in banking at the moment, and James, maybe bring you in on this one. I think the last question there, which seems to be disappearing down to the bottom because of a time differential. So maybe a conceptual idea based upon examples from the banking sector that you've seen that particularly sort of relates for us here.
As in the use cases that we're actually observing?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Well, a couple of things. So there's the direct scenarios, but as Paul mentioned, there's also just the existence of this creates change by the fact that it exists. So there's a few ones. So with the accredited data recipients that went live in July, there were two that went through that process and completed the process and actually got something in market. And the two scenarios were very different that are implementing. One of them was Regional Australia Bank, and what they're doing is they're using data given to them through the CDR in the banking sector by customers to facilitate a home loan. So I'm doing a home loan, and normally I have to give statements and salary statements and a whole bunch of stuff to get a full approved position for my home loan. The CDR is being used by RAB to actually get that information directly from transaction histories and to, so not have to exchange paper. And it's also being used to help understand what the current financial position of a customer so that they can understand what products they've already got so that they can actually sell appropriately to that customer. But from a customer perspective, it just means that instead of having to type all that stuff into a home loan or provide all that information to a banker or sort of mail it in or something like that, they can share it from any of their existing banking providers and get that immediately. So that's an example. Applying that to the energy sector, at the moment, you've got Energy Made Easy and VEC that are helping with comparison, but they are unable to take into account the actual plan that a customer is on. They're able to look at the plans on market and say, this is the best one for you and give me some of your information, but they're unable to look at the actual usage of this customer. You know, what is their energy profile? How much are they actually using? But also, what are they being charged for that usage? They may be on an awesome plan at the moment that they've somehow negotiated, etc. Or they may have certain unique characteristics such as concessions, etc. So in that scenario, it improves the ability to give a comparison, which is more effective for the customer, but also do that with asking the customer less questions because you can go straight to the source. So that's the first one. The second one is Frollo. So Frollo was the other accredited recipient for banking. And what they are doing is they are doing a personal financial management tool. So it's a financial literacy and management system. And what it does is it allows someone to actually import all their transactions, and they do analytics over that. And they say, oh, this is how much you're spending on groceries, and this is how much you're spending on coffee. And hey, maybe you should be saving more, or people like you do this. And they are able to apply analytics over the top of that to actually make recommendations and to suggest improved financial behaviour that will actually meet the goals of the individual. And they allow you to set goals and things like that. Now, translating that to the energy sector, the whole topic of decarbonisation comes in. You know, consumers are very interested in this, but they don't necessarily have the tools to be able to act on that interest. You know, there was that comment about apathy. As far as I'm concerned, customer apathy with data is a myth. Customers, we've done a lot of sex testing. People are not apathetic about their data. They feel resigned because they don't have the tools, and people don't, you know, I get a checkbox that says terms and conditions and I've got no more control than that. And it's just, well, that again. People are resigned. They're not apathetic. The vast majority of customers are very engaged with their data if there is a value add service that is going to help them. If the services are terrible, they're not interested. This is a logical thing, but they are interested in the data if the services are good. So, you know, so that's a good example. If I was able to manage my carbon footprint really effectively through an AI-driven service that was able to access all this data, I would sign up for that. So there are a couple of examples. The third one would be, which is more of a passive one, is we introduced CDR, only the 4 major banks, and one of the neobanks released their own APIs just to show the big banks up. I thought that was cool. That was up. And I think that's a good thing. And that's exactly what Paul was talking about. It actually promotes competition in the ecosystem just through the existence of it.
Yep. And if I could add a couple of another example from the UK, where open banking has been around for a little while, a lot of the data sharing is account transaction history that's consumed by accounting package providers and used for accounting services for business customers. So, you know, we'd expect that will become an important use case in Australia for banking. But equally, there are a lot of commercial arrangements between landlords and tenants, for example, where energy usage might become something that's relevant to managing that relationship. And particularly as you try to decarbonise the economy, as all of our state governments have agreed they want to do. Property owners and landlords might want to enter into lease arrangements where energy usage is something that's considered to be important and needs to be managed.
I might actually additionally bring Violette in on that as well, because I think there's some really sort of interesting potential use cases, and Violette, just get your perspective on what sort of rings for the energy sector here.
In terms of use cases, I mean, there's just so many use cases. And I think, as both Paul and James have alluded to, there's probably use cases that we can probably see, but there's probably a whole heap of other ones that the innovators will see the opportunities to sort of grab and collect. I mean, it depends on from whose perspective. Like from a consumer perspective, I mean, you know, James has already talked about some of the use cases around, you know, enabling consumers to compare and contrast offers between retailers and between other parties in the sector. I think there are also use cases where the consumer can probably better be informed about the performance of its you know, distributed resources that reside at its premises because of the access to data around the register. We can talk a little bit about, you know, some of the data that might be available, the efficiency of some of the appliances on its premises, and how that they are sort of performing. You know, multi-sector kind of sort of use cases where you're comparing and contrasting not only energy but gas and other things, you know, as CDR does evolve going forward. I mean, there are a lot of sort of use cases, and from an accredited third party sort of perspective, the access to the data that it could have under energy together with sort of banking and other areas means it can combine a lot of that data to actually offer services to the consumer. So I mean, there's a raft of probably use cases, both in the energy sector and outside of the energy sector, that open up opportunities for consumers to sort of compare and contrast what's available to them in the sector and against other services that they get across other sectors as well.
Thanks, Violette. I think this actually sort of joins in nicely with another question that we've had from Hannah Heath. And she asked if the ultimate objective of CDR is to drive cross-sector innovation, and most cutting-edge innovations come from start-up new entities, tend to be capital constrained at their outset. How does the regime find the balance between the high cost of accreditation and security requirements, which are built and informed by the industry incumbents, and that actually excluding the very innovative parties who are actively looking to disrupt and unlock the potential benefits for consumers? So it's that balance. How maybe Paul might start with you on that one.
Thank you. I think that's actually the ACCC's problem, or been our problem to solve. You know, I begin by saying that the information security requirements weren't set by the incumbents; they were set by the ACCC, following professional advice. And I think if you look at the recently released cybersecurity strategy, the direction for the whole of the Australian economy is towards better cybersecurity for controls for business, not less. So the challenge we have is essentially to make sure that there is a high bar for cybersecurity, but to make sure that it is easy to demonstrate that that bar is being met. One of our initial cohort of data recipients has done some really interesting work with a cloud computing provider to automate control testing, so that rather than having to have a very expensive audit process to demonstrate that the controls are in place and working, that it's possible to run a suite of pre-programmed controls over the cloud environment and just demonstrate very easily that the controls are in place and that they're still working. So things like that can certainly reduce the cost. We're also looking at tiered accreditation, so that you know, very sensitive data like transaction history is obviously needs to be protected. There might be less sensitive data sets in the future. But I think what we will see in the cybersecurity environment is a focus on everybody in the economy meeting high standards of data protection.
Can I add to that, Joe?
James, yes, I'll bring you on that as well, please.
I'd just like to say, and Paul can't blow his own trumpet here, but this is an area where I would give kudos to the ACCC. They're actually working very hard on this issue. Obviously, with the first implementation, security was paramount. You know, it's banking data. You know, the last thing anybody wanted was for us to open up too quickly and that to cause problems and then have to walk that back. But the ACCC is doing a lot of consultation at the moment around intermediaries, which will help reduce costs, investing in the conformance testing suite, which will give more automated testing to reduce costs. You know, this is a real area of focus, and it is a real challenge to do that. The thing I'd add, and this relates back to what we were saying, I think, in some of the earlier responses, is One of the other things that reduces accreditation costs for startups is existing tools. So the more consistent we are as we go across sectors, the more like banking from a technical perspective energy is, the more that the vendors who have emerged to support that market of fintechs that are actually trying to get banking data will tailor their products for energy and then offer out-of-the-box solutions, which lowers the technical costs. The accredited recipients so far have said that the process is about 50% of the cost, but the technology is also about 50% of the cost. So the more we can be consistent cross-sector, the lower that technology cost comes. You know, you get open source tools, you get libraries, you get, you know, I go to AWS and I spin up an ADR solution and I can, you know, use that as a starting point. You know, I automate, you know, pre-packaged solutions that give me that level of security that will meet the accreditation process. These are the things that will emerge as long as we're consistent. If we start doing industry by industry variation, we create lots of industry silos and you can't get vendors spanning them. So that's a real important way of us trying to drive that forward. And that's one of the focuses that I've got from the technology standards, is trying to facilitate that vendor ecosystem through consistency, because that will have a direct impact on cost.
Thanks, James. And I know we just want to let people know who are asking questions, obviously given the fantastic depth and insight we're getting, we're not going to have time to get through them all today, but what I would encourage people to do, there'll be a short survey afterwards. One of those will be focused on potential for follow-up events. So please do submit any ideas and suggestions you'd like covered in that survey. I might come on to, there's another question here about the balance with public good outcomes. There's I don't think we've got a name for this one, but there is a significant value and opportunity for Insight through having access to large database of consumer data, which this type of visibility currently held by the retailers. What's the scope within CDR to give access to large volume of consumer data to organisations that focus on public good outcomes, so consumer advocates, public research institutions? Would somebody like to take that one?
I can take that one. So at the moment, the CDR rules really only permit the sharing of data by consumers for their own benefit. I think there is a legitimate question about whether consumers should be able to donate their data, but the threshold requirement will be that the consumer must still be able to give informed consent to share that data. That's different from disaggregated data. So, you know, there are different ways of sharing either disaggregated or anonymized data that can be done without requiring consumer consent. So I think anyone who's looking to get access to data sets should look at a number of different ways of you know, what are the data sets available and how do they get them.
Another question that's come up really is about the experience, or sort of, I guess, the lack of progress on this elsewhere. I know Noel Schubert's asked a question about will it eventually apply in WA, but also the fact that, you know, this sort of cross-economy perspective hasn't happened elsewhere yet. Maybe some perspectives on that. Paul, maybe to start with you, because I think...
Sure. So I recently attended a similar event to this run by the OECD, and I was struck by the number of countries that are looking to implement similar regimes. You know, countries like Egypt and Chile, New Zealand, as I said, have put out a discussion paper. So there certainly is a very big focus in many countries around the world in how to free up consumer data. I think that you know, the early experience of open banking in the UK has demonstrated that there's certainly strong early demand and that it does lead to innovation. But you know, if you look at past innovations, I think, adoption of cars took, 10 years to the point that cars had substantially replaced horses. So, we're at the very early point. Everybody can see the opportunity, and the early signs are promising. But in any significant innovation, you always have something that looks like logistic growth. You have a slow start, a point of inflection where growth is very fast, and then you might find that late take-up is actually slows down as you get to people who just don't want to engage. But I think there's certainly a very strong belief that's supported by the strength of the early take-up and the strength of the value propositions that are being introduced.
Well, that sort of emphasises to me, maybe Violette, you might like to comment on this one. We see certainly with the decentralisation and the rapid uptake of DER across Australia really is leading the world. And by association is bringing a lot of visibility here in terms of how we're progressing and how we're dealing with that. A lot of this hasn't been done before, and so the energy sector's getting its head around being first. And from what you're saying there, Paul, it's actually pretty similar here. There's a lot of focus, and it's great to hear the amount of interest in the OECD countries. But I guess by association, there'll be a lot of eyes watching how we progress here with the cross economy strategy. So, Violette, you might want to comment on that one.
I think you've summarised it nicely, Joe. I think we're very much. I think Australians always shy to be the first, but I think on the distributed side, we're well and truly at the cutting edge there in South Australia, and we're seeing it in other parts of the East Coast and Western Australia too, right? Western Australia very much so, and very much leading thinkers around how to better leverage and sort of reform its system and market through its DER roadmap that it released earlier this year, I think, or late last year. So, very much with data and data access across the economy, we're sort of seeing, again, sort of leading the world, and the two go hand in glove. I really think that the two are key enablers for consumers to get better outcomes.
Fantastic. I know we're pretty much up against time now. I might just have a quick closing thought, and starting with James, perhaps if we can keep this to sort of 30 seconds each. And what I'd encourage the audience to do as well, we haven't got time to cover off the forthcoming AIE events, but please do visit the AIE.org website and have a look at the events page, and you'll see what we've got coming up, and you'd be very welcome to join us. But James, I might just hand to you for a quick closing thought.
Well, the number one thing I'd say in closing, and just looking at the tenor of the questions, is that as far as I'm concerned, any country that is not facing into the problem of data sharing and harnessing the value of data is going to be following rather than leading in the next century. It's pretty much data is the new oil, is a term that gets talked about all the time. And at the moment, Australia with the CDR is at the forefront of that. There's always excuses to go slowly. But if we don't go forward and take a step and then see what we trot in and then change our direction as a result of that, we will never get anywhere. And if we do follow another jurisdiction, then we'll be using their companies, their technology, their vendors, and it'll be their economic power that's being generated rather than ours. And Australians we're an early adopter environment. We're good with technology. We like this stuff. We're a small enough market to make this stuff happen. We have an opportunity here to be national, as a nation, to be leaders in this space and generate massive dividends for the country. And I think it's myopic not to do it.
Fantastic. Thanks, James. And Paul?
Thank you. Oh, look, I completely agree with James's comments, and I'd add that we'll do this better if we get really strong engagement from all of the stakeholders. I'd encourage everybody to visit our website, cdr.gov.au, and to subscribe to our regular newsletters, where we regularly publish consultations that we're doing on various aspects of the consumer data right. So there's also some great videos there that explain how it works. But very much encourage strong engagement in the development from anyone interested in this market.
Thanks, Paul. Violette, any last comments you'd like to share?
Look, I think it's all been said in the session, but I think it's actually to try and bring some excitement to this, James, as James did at the start. I really think it's an exciting time for the energy sector. I really do. I think there's so many opportunities to shift the trust, shift the perception for consumers, and I think, you know, I think CDR can play a really important, critical role in that. So it is a very exciting time. So it'll be really important for us to sort of leverage this opportunity to make sure it does deliver the value it promises to.
Great stuff. I might just hand over to Stephanie. I think she'd like to say just a final word of thanks.
Yes, so thank you very much to our panel members this morning. Thanks for your insights and thought leadership and expertise. Thank you to all our attendees and followers of the AIE. We look forward to seeing you all again at future events, and everyone stay safe and have a great day.